Hi, I've just spent the day in Chichester and its environs, trying to find images and settings that Keats used as inspiration for his poem Eve of St Agnes, which was written 200 years ago this week. So I've been lucky enough to speak to some locals and be allowed in some places that inspired Keats. So I hope you enjoy this video.
Around Chichester, we're lucky enough to have met Keats himself just over my shoulder. Let's go meet him. So I'm standing in front of the house where Keats stayed for a few days in January of 1819, where he started to write the Eve of St Agnes.
So I'm just going to read to you briefly from Robert Gittings' biography of John Keats, who provides some useful information about the influences for the poem. And he first says that Keats, being anxious to get off to Chichester after the death of his brother Tom for some convalescence, spoke to Isabella Jones, who tended towards the Gothic in her tastes, and she had an eye for popular superstitions. So looking for a topical theme, she suggested to Keats that they were approaching the 20th of January, the Eve of St Agnes. On that evening, according to legend, young girls could receive a vision of their true love. It was a theme which fitted the slacker or more romantic mood which had swept into Keats's poetry after Tom's death, a medieval Gothic and Chattertonian conception, at the opposite pole from the stern classic architecture of the first two books of Hyperion. It was fanciful and imaginative, in the same mood as the smaller poems he had been copying for his brother George in America. The other influence, Gittings tells us, is a very important fresco that Keats was lucky enough to see in an engraving form, the Camposanto frescoes by an unknown master of the mid-14th century. And this particular fresco that inspired him was called The Triumph of Death, and it had in it a medieval hunting party of lords, ladies and grooms who are suddenly confronted by the reminder of the grim physical facts of death. 3 corpses burst out of their coffins in horrible detail, one bloated, one decayed, and one fleshless. And Gittings goes on to say that though the idea that in the midst of life we are in death, and how that is a common medieval pictorial conception, there is, however, an urgency and a reality about this, and Keats takes it beyond a more formal traditional exercise. And of course, he'd just come from the deathbed of his brother, dying of the family disease, tuberculosis, of a disease of the most distressing nature. And Gittings goes on to say that love is also entwined with these ideas of death, and how love for him never evades the background of death, and that this was why he bodied out the engraving of the Triumph of Death into the moving stanzas of the Eve of St Agnes, and how the use of and the figure of the beadsman who begins and ends the poem is the pervading hermit depicted in the Triumph of Death. which I will show you now. So it's not the best copy of the fresco, but you can look it up yourselves. But you can just about make out the coffins in the bottom left-hand corner and the hunting party in the centre. And just under where it says 1325, you can see a hermit sitting and some animals depicted around him. So when Keats got off the coach in the middle of Chichester, he instantly came upon a new sight that seemed like an answer to his poetic mood. All his reading in the past few weeks had thrown him back into the romantic and Gothic, to the medieval rather than the classic, to Chatterton and Spenser rather than to Milton and Wordsworth. As he walked through the streets with Brown back to their hosts, the cathedral sprang straight from the streets above them, on the citizens' doorsteps, its separate bell tower with the circling jackdaws actually fronting the road itself. Unlike Canterbury, it was almost all as it had been in the early Middle Ages, a building of one character hardly altered in 600 years, except that clear glass showed where the Roundheads had smashed the coloured diamonding with their pikes. For one in a romantic and Gothic mood, here was a setting come to life, and as Keats was drawn by Brown into the elderly card-playing circle of their hosts, old dowager card parties, as he wrote to George, he found that these ancient ladies lived among even more ancient and medieval prospects, rooms dating from the Middle Ages with winding stone stairs and pointed windows, cellars with broad Norman supporting pillars. The Georgian facade in houses in the midst of the city often concealed a far older period of history. So walking around Chichester, I was able to take a few pictures from the outside, but also inside the crypt and what used to be the Guild Hall, which is now the Vicar's Hall, which is actually having some painters and decorators in, but they were able to let us in. So this is a picture I stole from the internet because Chichester Cathedral is undergoing a bit of a facelift, but you really do get the impression when you're walking around it that it's rising up above one, and the bell tower is in the middle of the road, which is a bit odd. But as you walk around Chichester, you can really see the Middle Ages in the 21st century, and when you go into these buildings, you really get a sense of the Gothic and the winding stony alcoves and staircases and stained glass windows, which would definitely have been an influence to Keats for his poem. There are also lots of pictures of dim emblazonings and kings and queens through history on the walls, and we definitely got a good insight into the Chichester that Keats would have seen. On Saturday the 23rd of January 1819, Keats and Brown took leave of their elderly hosts in Eastgate Square, Chichester, and walked along the gusty, exhilarating coast road to the waterside mill house down by the harbour, 13 miles away at Bedhampton. And that is where we went today as well.
Well, welcome to Bedhampton on a very cold January day. 200 years ago yesterday, John Keats would have walked 13 miles from Chichester to Bedhampton with his friend Charles Armitage Brown, and this is the mill house where they stayed. John Keats spent 2 weeks in the village writing the Eve of St Agnes, and the poem was finished on the 2nd of February 1819. After that, John Keats would have travelled back to London. My name is Nigel Gossop. I've just written a book called John Keats in Bedhampton. How's that? Ooh.
Bedhampton has another claim to fame as the final port of call for Keats on his way to Rome the following year in 1820, but we'll come to that another time. But it's interesting to observe that Bedhampton is celebrating the bicentenary of Keats's first day, and has been very useful to us in our knowledge and understanding of the Eve of St Agnes. So Nigel showed us around Bedhampton, took us on a little walking tour, telling us that Bedhampton is relatively unchanged since Keats was there, apart from some destruction of a biscuit factory and the creation of the railway that passes through. He showed us a house called the Elms, which took its inspiration from Walpole's house in Strawberry Hill nearby us, and I'll just show you a picture of that, because Keats would definitely have seen this building and been very impressed by it, particularly because it is designed in the modern Gothic style of the late 18th century. So it's really an impressive structure, pinkish colour and lots of white twiddly bits. I'm sure there's a proper name for those twiddly bits, and here's a depiction of what it would have looked like about 200 years ago.
On the 25th of January 1819, John Keats came here to Stansted Park, Manor House and Chapel to be part of the celebrations for the consecration of this chapel. When he wandered around the manor house and enjoyed the artwork and the tapestries, he got lots of raw material for the setting that appears in Eve of St Agnes. We've been lucky enough to be granted access to the chapel today, so we're going to take a closer look.
So we were taken inside the chapel, which was a great privilege because it's not open to the public, and we were shown around the stained glass windows, which had on them lots of heraldic and family history. If you want to know more about Stansted Park, you can certainly look it up. But we were told that it's relatively unchanged. You can see that that it's a Jewish chapel because the owner, Lewis Way, was very fond of the conversion of the Jews to Christianity, and he was rather an eccentric character. But we were told that lots of updates have been made since, and what we were looking at just then was some coats of arms for the other families. But what's impressive was that the pews are exactly the same, so Keats would have been sitting in these black wooden pews, and the whiteness and the plainness of the chapel is the same today as it was then 200 years ago. But I tried to zoom in a little bit on some of the details, because in Eve of St Agnes there's mention of the vaults and the window shapes and some of the cornicing, so I thought you could get a better impression. Although of course it was a cold January day, but I don't think it was as cold as it would have been 200 years ago.
So Keats certainly did not come here for religious reasons, but as he sat through the long service with Brown and John Snooks, he absorbed yet another version of the Gothic, which added to the crowded scene painting of his poem. The triple windows, the rosy shields, The diamond panes and the coloured light shining on the congregation helped to make a picture transmuted by the silver moonlight drench of imagination into a casement high and triple arched there was, all garlanded and with carven imageries of fruits and flowers and bunches of knotgrass, and diamonded with panes of quaint device, innumerable of stains and splendid dyes, as are the tiger moth's deep damasked wings, and in the midst, among thousand heraldries and twilight saints and dim emblazonings, a shielded scutcheon blushed with blood of queens and kings.
So the owner of the house, Lewis Way, had chosen the feast of the conversion of St Paul, which is on 25th of January, for the dedication of the building, which he had raised from a former hunting lodge to a house of religion that bore the marks of his own extremely individual character. The Regency Gothic design was of great delicacy, apparently. The owner's taste showed everywhere, from the stained glass of the triple-arched windows in the nave, embellished with scutcheons of the Fitzalan family, to the unique painted east window, the only window in a Christian place of worship that is wholly Jewish in design and symbolism. And as you can see, there are still great features left. Lots of decay, of course, but lots of efforts to conserve this great example of history. So we were really lucky to wander around these private chapels and places, and you are welcome to go and visit on your own Keats pilgrimage. Look out for the blue plaques around London and around England. Of course, his final resting place was in Rome, which will be the feature of my next video journal, I hope. I hope you've enjoyed looking at some of these images. It's definitely been a wonderful experience for me, who incidentally was studying this poem and Keats's collected poetry 20 years ago this year as well. So that's it from me. This is me in Liphook, where I found Keats's estate agent.